maybe, oh, maybe we don't have permissions to do that. Okay. It looks like we're all here. Excellent. Welcome, everybody, to the Security and Privacy panel. It's great to see everyone and excited for the discussion. Let me first take a moment to introduce our panelists, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'll start with Franzi Roesner. Franzi is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. She's also an adjunct in the information school there. She works on many different exciting topics, including those at the intersection of security and augmented reality, as well as some interesting user-focused topics, which I think our attendees were very excited to hear about. So thanks for joining us, Franzi. Good to see you. Next, we have Dave Choffness, who is an associate professor in the Corey College of Computer Sciences at Northeastern and a member of the Cybersecurity and Privacy Institute. Dave works primarily in distributed systems and networking. He's done a lot of really cool work lately on privacy and the Internet of Things. Thanks, Dave, for joining us. Next, I'll introduce Dave Levin, who is a professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, in the Department of Computer Science there, where he works on a number of topics, including, I think, most recently, a lot of work on internet censorship and designing various tools to measure and circumvent internet censorship. And finally, I'll turn to Stefan Savage, who it's my honor to introduce. Stefan is a professor in the computer science department at the University of California in San Diego. He works on just about anything having to do with security. I think if it relates to security, he's probably worked on it. So we're excited to hear from everybody today. Thanks for taking the time, everyone. Okay, great. So I think without further ado, I think we can kick it right into the questions. And I think for those of you following along at home, which I think is all of you, there is a Slack channel called SIGCOMM 2020 Panel Privacy, where I will monitor questions if you'd like to post things there and upvote them. I understand there's also a Zoom Q&A, and I see in there's an invitation to the industry sponsor event. Don't go to that. This is way cooler, but I'll follow the Q&A there too. So let's kick it off with in the Slack channel, I pinned a couple Kickstarter questions, which I shared with our panelists earlier. Why don't we go around and just talk about the first one first, which is, so I asked two questions there. Your most important problem or area in security and privacy that you're not working on, but others are. And then the second question I posed was, what's your favorite paper, security privacy, in the last N years? I'd like to hear N equals 1, because it's easy to kind of go back and pull out seminal papers, but I think it'd be interesting and fun to hear what people are reading lately. So I guess I introduce people in a certain order. We could run that order, and I think our panelists should feel free to chime in, go back and forth. We don't have to make this a parade. So Franzi, do you want to kick it off?
Sure, I can do that. Yeah, thanks for organizing this and asking these really great questions. I'm super curious to hear everybody else's answers. So I'll start with the first one, which is, what are the areas of security and privacy, or the topics, problems that are important that I'm not working on? I think the two that immediately came to mind for me was, first, topics at the intersection of kind of security and AI and machine learning. So things related to adversarial machine learning, like tricking machine learning models with adversarial inputs. Also looking more broadly, thinking about kind of fairness in machine learning and explainability. I think some of those things maybe start to go a little bit further from what you might traditionally think of as security, but as a security person, everything looks like a security question to me. Basically everything where there's, the opportunity for things to work in unexpected ways from how you've designed it. So, so I mean, that's one huge topic, but that's one that came to mind. And the other is around essentially microarchitectural side channels, so things like Spectre. So places where our layers of abstraction break down and there are kind of unexpected information leaks or other things like that. I think there's a lot of really interesting work going on in that space right now. I will cheat with one sentence and mention two areas that I am working in because I think they're also important. One is around kind of online misinformation and disinformation, and the other is around kind of human factors in security more generally, but specifically thinking about vulnerable populations or marginalized communities and how to understand and support them. So I'll stop there and let other people share their thoughts.
Those are exciting. I want to hear more about the ones you're working on too. Let's, Dave Choffness, do you want to chime in next?
Sure. I mean, I'll start by saying the things that Franzi just mentioned at the end are two areas that I am not working on, which I'm super excited about. So thank you for your work on that. I do want to talk about something that's maybe a little bit less technical than what we tend to think of or focus on, because I think a lot of us are doing really interesting work that can move the needle on privacy or security, but ultimately the weak link is, the so-called carbon-based nodes, the people in the loop here. So I'm really interested in that aspect of things. It's an area that I haven't worked in, particularly how you do outreach and education, and not just education to adults, but that there's the kind of education we need to have about privacy and security and how to think about those topics needs to happen much earlier. So this kind of moves into more of the education side of things, but just trying to understand how do we take our all of our technical insights and then try to work on closing the loop on the human side.
Excellent. That's super exciting. Dave?
Hey, yeah, thanks again for having me a part of this panel. In a similar vein to what Franzi was saying, I think one of the most important problems I'm not working on is in regards to AI, less about empowering AI and more about putting guardrails on it. There are a lot of things coming out that concern me quite a bit. It's powerful. It's a very powerful set of features, but a lot of these things I see as being particularly powerful and empowering for oppressive regimes. And so I think we really have to understand what some of the fundamental limitations are for AI, what some of the fundamental limitations aren't, and to try to understand, like, what can we do to put guardrails on this? What can we keep from happening? What sort of threats do we see coming down the pike? And what can we do about it? But right now, it's just hard to understand what the capabilities are, which it seems like there's a lot.
Thanks. Stefan?
Thanks. So first off, I think all of the topics everyone has mentioned are fascinating. I'm going to take a slightly different tack because I think one of the great things about our community right now is that all of these things that have been discussed are being worked on. It's kind of like a renaissance period in security work. There's just so much great work going on. So it's a struggle to come up with things that are not being worked on. But I think that one place where our community does have a little bit of a blind spot is looking at kind of big picture questions. So, two examples of those that I wanted to call out. One is kind of, what is the game theory for cyber defenses? So we are always coming up with this fix and that fix, and then the attacker gets around it, and they get around it by making the attack more sophisticated. And so it's kind of like the antibiotic problem in the large, where what we end up doing is training a better and better and better attacker through kind of this Darwinian process. And we never step back and say, all right, where does this lead? Does this get us to a better place, or does this, not get us to a better place? And I think the other place where that comes up is privacy, where we spend a lot of time on technology and measurement that's around the margins, but not a lot of time looking at kind of the fundamental drivers. And that's the lack of an alternative economic model to advertising. And absent that, there's a consent loophole that is so big that like everything drives through it. but no one is talking about, is there a way that we can make not all of the incentives focused on extracting all of our information from us? And that's because it's hard, but this is a community that I think is well suited to look at it.
Fantastic. I think lots of good fodder for follow-up questions and discussion here. This is great. I think, can we hear before we kind of dive in on those? And I see already there's a question in the Q&A, which we can take eventually as well. But before we dive in, how about from each of you, one cool paper in the last let's say in the last year. Franzi, I know you read a lot. You were the using security PC chair, so
I know it's very hard to choose. I have multiple examples, but I'll try to stick with one. Okay, so one from Usenix Security that's being presented this week that I think is really cool is called, let me find the actual title of it. Who's calling, characterizing robocalls through audio and metadata analysis. This is basically a paper looking at robocalls through a measurement study. So they set up a honeypot of like 60,000 phone numbers over a year and analyzed the robocalls that they got. So I think it's a really nice example of kind of a measurement of a real life phenomenon that many people are interested and affected by. So that's one from our program this week that I'd recommend.
Excellent, thanks. We can mix up the order just for fun, right? Let's see. Let's go to Stefan next, just to mix it up.
Oh, all right. So actually, one of the more fun papers I've read in a while was the 2020 Chi paper by Ben Zhao and company on how do you do wearable microphone jamming, because it had all this cute low-level stuff, and then there was an actual artifact, and it provided a way for individuals to have some agency, you know, independent of all of these sensors around them. But I want to plug one other paper really quick, because people almost never plug these papers. There's a really nice SOK paper at Security and Privacy on cyber insurance, which everyone kind of talks about, but very few people have done the deep dive to understand. This came out of Eurocom and Symantec. And it's a really nice treatment of all of the previous work, so that you can read this paper and actually feel like you understand what are the open questions in cyber insurance. And I think we don't have enough papers like that.
Thanks, Stefan. I'll just call out Dave and see who comes next.
Go for it.
Oh, I thought that meant you were taking it. All right, I'll go. It's been a long year since March, where there has been less reading happening. But something that stood out is one of my colleagues' papers on pre-installed Android malware, or just Android software. Some of it seems like malware. I just thought it was really interesting because it required getting this crowdsourced data set, and then they did this deep analysis through the supply chain of all the crazy things. Like, it's sort of bad enough, all the stuff we find in software you can download, but then what people are stuck with, the software that comes with your phone. I thought it was really interesting, the way they analyze that in depth. And also, just to call out other Dave's Geneva work. It's near and dear to my heart because it's squarely in the topic of net neutrality and censorship, and something that my group has been working on for a while, but sort of taking it to this really nice, elegant solution that continues to deliver even, this week, is, Dave made that announcement about China moving to blocking ESNI. So I thought that stuff was really cool.
Thanks, man. So my favorite paper of last year was from another buddy of mine, Aaron Schulman. He had a paper, Usenix Security last year, 2019, called Please Pay Inside. And they showed that just by monitoring Bluetooth and doing a bunch of extra clever tricks, that they're able to detect credit card skimmers in gas station pumps. And I think what's really important about this, was just like the scale of these kinds of attacks, the prevalence of them. Ask Aaron about some of the stories afterwards. Like, this has really led to like ride-alongs with Secret Service, like really good stuff. But I think one of the most concerning sort of eye-opening things is that attackers are physically altering our critical infrastructure. And so a lot of the defenses that we've been able to use in the past just don't apply when they can physically alter your hardware. And so I think this paper is really important because it shows a path forward for dealing with something like that.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone. You've definitely helped me populate my my research group reading list for the next month or so. Excellent. We have a few questions, I think, both in the Slack and in the Zoom Q&A. I think, let's see. I think Ellen Zagura has a question here that's been upvoted a couple times, and it actually relates a little bit to a few of you mentioned, you know, bigger picture issues. A couple of you mentioned privacy, outreach, etc. And you know, I'll read her question and then riff on it a bit. Her question reads: how do we get technical audiences to welcome, appreciate, and evaluate socio-technical work such as privacy and underserved communities? And I'll note that several of you talked about privacy in your comments of cool work, and privacy is, I think, an interesting area because it is inherently at the boundary of technology and people, policy, HCI, users, etc. And I think Dave, you in particular talked about outreach to various communities there. So anyone who wants to chime in, please pick that question up.
I just want to pick it up to hand it off, which is one of the best ways to appreciate underserved communities is to understand what they're going through. I think it's really, really easy to assume that our security challenges are the same as anybody else's security challenges. And so, Franzi, some of your work has totally opened my eyes as to like the totally different security challenges that people face. So I think doing that kind of work is super important to see like, oh wow, not everybody's experiencing the same thing that I am.
Yeah, I would say that's been really eye-opening for me. Also, just doing the work. So I think my research background, like I started off kind of much more in the technical depth than I am now. So like my undergrad research was in computer architecture. And I kind of, over the last few years, have started more and more talking to people because I've had this, you know, realization is like, it's not enough to say, like, we can't just sit here and think about what are the important problems and say like, oh, you know, journalists probably have security needs, so let's build some things for journalists. You can't do that in isolation. And so I've had a variety of work looking at actually understanding different communities, and you know, it's challenging. It's what you kind of like, especially as technical researchers, is to say like, okay, we talked to these people, and then now we understand their threat models and their needs, and so now we know what to build. And unfortunately, that last step is not usually so straightforward. Sometimes what you learn is that there's nothing you can build to solve these problems, that there's some really fundamental tensions in the needs and constraints people have. So we've done work talking to journalists, for instance, or survivors of human trafficking. One of the, to the question of, you know, what's one of my favorite papers of the last few years, one that I also had on my list that I didn't mention, or a set of work, is there's some really great work coming out of Cornell Tech on intimate partner violence, kind of both the technical side and the human side of that. I think that's another really good example of that this type of work that I point to, kind of understanding what are the implications of the technologies we're building, and what are the actual needs and constraints of these populations that without understanding the people, we can guess at, but we might not be building the right things.
So I just wanted to highlight something that Franzi said, because I think it's really spot on, which is that the challenge that these problems have with the general technical audience is that they're messy, right? They don't have crisp abstractions. They don't have crisp answers. And it requires a very different set. It requires one to appreciate a very different set of more qualitative aspects that are not kind of part and parcel of the way we do most computer science research. And so I think that, now I think the community of people who appreciate that has grown tremendously over the last decade, but I think it's deeply related to the same reason why we have, for example, more tech papers than anything else, because they're the easiest ones to do. They're really crisp, you know, you did it, done. and everything else you kind of got to convince people. And this is at the extreme side of that point where it's like, okay, trust me, I have the problem right. You just got to believe me.
Ellen's question also had something about evaluation. I think it'd be interesting to hear people's thoughts on that, because Stefan mentioned, of course, the inherent messiness of the domain, and of course there are qualitative there are qualitative methods of all kinds. Franzi, I think you might be have a good perspective on this as a recent program committee chair, who's seen some of these papers appear at a security conference. So how does that type of work typically get evaluated? I assume by experts on the program committee who know those methods, but can you speak a little bit more to the evaluation of that kind of work? What makes a good security and privacy paper that touches on those kinds of topics?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and there are multiple parts there. So one is maybe to directly answer Ellen's question about how to get technical audiences to appreciate and evaluate this work. I think part of it is recognizing that these are fundamentally interdisciplinary questions, and so we have to use methods from systems and security, but also from human-computer interaction and even sociology. And so bringing those experts onto the program committee, I think that's a shift that at least I've seen, over the last maybe decade, rounding up. Sort of like when I started grad school, I think there were like more human-facing papers you wouldn't necessarily submit to some of the main computer security conferences, where they are now much more common and accepted as a core part of this whole problem and solution space. And I think part of that has been a shift in the makeup of the program committees, of people who know how to evaluate this work and do this type of work themselves. I think there's also I think there can be a perception that because it's so fuzzy and messy, that doing qualitative work or work with users is not rigorous. That's definitely something that I kind of thought before I had done some of that work myself and really understood the different qualitative methodologies. Like, oh, you talked to 15 people, how could you even know anything from that? That doesn't seem very scientific, but there are, well-established qualitative methods and other types of strategies for doing that work and evaluating it. And there are many, many people who, are experts on evaluating it and doing it. And so there's, to get into that type of work, there's also a learning curve, and what is the language and the evaluation of this type of work.
Excellent, thanks. And I'll also point out that there are quite a few nice HCI and qualitative methods papers this week at Usenix Security. So thanks. I think all of us could probably, all of our panelists could probably chime in on this topic some more, but I think we have some other questions. There was, I see one in the Slack channel that I think, there's a couple actually that I think I can lump together related to IoT and smart device, if you will, security and privacy. Okay, so let's take a couple of these and sort of tie them into Stefan's big vision question as well. So VS Seger asks, how are you going to address the IoT and security versus end-to-end privacy debate? And I read this to mean, on the one hand, we want our devices that we connect to the network to be end-to-end encrypted. On the other hand, as Stefan points out, there is, increasing, well, not increasing, there is a substantial incentive for the manufacturers, the service providers, et cetera, to collect data about us when we plug these devices in. So there's a tension there that I think Vyas is getting at. And then I think I'm going to lump this question with Rahul Sharma's question here that says, there's been a lot of work surveying, looking at how various devices spy on consumers. Which ones, in your views, need more attention? And then, so I think that I think there are a couple of our panelists could certainly talk about that. But let me sort of wrap it all together. How do we solve it? Could even tie back to some of Stefan's game theory questions if points if we wanted to. So I think anyone can pick that one up too.
I can start. This is my IoT lab I switched to.
That was awesome teleporting.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is the lab we can't access for a while now. But everything you see in the picture is internet connected. And you know, it's getting crazy, right? Because why does your microwave need to be internet connected? There's just, you know, increasingly, I think we're going to see every device that didn't previously have a connection but has power is going to be able to connect one way or another. And the reason, as I think these questions are alluding to, is that there's opportunities to monetize the data that comes out of these. It's not purely for functionality. And it's a really hard space because increasingly we are seeing devices using things like strong encryption that make it very difficult for us to man in the middle of the network traffic, which brings this tension between security and privacy, at least in one incantation of it, that we have you know, devices that, you know, as security people, we of course want these devices to properly validate certificates and prevent eavesdroppers from seeing what's in network traffic. On the other hand, these companies may be using it as a way to hide what they're doing from observers. And so this is something that we struggle with all the time when we're analyzing the network traffic coming out of our lab. And so, you know, one approach is, you know, there's a lot you can infer even from encrypted network traffic. So, you know, for example, we knew that the Ring doorbell was recording video without lighting up or alerting anyone about this happening because you can see it in network traffic. It's dead obvious when something is recording video because it's high bandwidth. So there's some things that you can tell without even decrypting data. I think, you know, another concern or another thing that we think about is how might there be ways to get access to devices that would allow you, allow researchers to do security analysis, privacy analysis of the kind where you do, say, man in the middling, but this is not given to the public. These are very controlled. It's sort of like how Apple has this program for security researchers where they vet you and then they send you a device that you can do, where you have root on the device. So you can do analysis, but this kind of ability would never be made accessible to any consumer's device. So I think, you know, taking examples of this along with ways to study devices that were not meant for testing purposes to make sure they're behaving the same way can be another way that we can move forward in this direction. But, you know, ultimately, I think, you know, this is going to be a problem that keeps coming up over and over again. And it's, for better or worse, I think we have to combine cases where you have some ground truth with as much inference as you can with controlled experiments, which is a lot of the ways that we do our analysis in our labs. So that's just my high level take on that, and I'll let others chime in.
Great, definitely interested to hear from others. Thanks, Dave. That was very thorough.
So I'll pipe in. I'm going to be the pessimist here. I think we are screwed for the foreseeable future because the cost structure of IoT is too low to support significant investment in security and privacy, except for the largest brands for whom it represents reputational damage. And so I think until it becomes a commodity and people are suffering as a result of violations of, you know, the integrity of their homes, that it's going to be very difficult to move the needle. We'll find ways that things aren't good here and there, but that's what people are going to produce is going to be something that has low time to market, low cost. And that's been true of consumer electronics forever. And it's the classic problem of having, how do you add security either before market or after market for devices where, you know, the bill of materials cost is, you know, $40. It's almost impossible from an economic standpoint. The one thing that I do think that and this is a little bit of a tangent to strict IoT, but one place I think that there is not enough attention being focused is on location privacy around carried devices, because I think that there is not enough appreciation about just how much truly fine-grained location information is being distributed. Like I would say, since Jeff Volker is not on here, that pretty much everyone in the audience, their location is being reported multiple times each day to people they have no idea are getting it. And that's, I think, a little scary and something that we could spend more time looking at.
Yeah, those are great points. One other thing you just reminded me of is, it's important also not to just think in technical terms, like how do we improve the security? How do we block, privacy problems? I think it's really important to loop policy in here. That's something we're starting to do. I've started working with Woody Hartzog, who's in the law school, focuses on privacy law. And I think one thing we can do as researchers is take what we find on the technical side and talk to lawyers, talk to policy people, understand, as Stefan said, this all has to exist in a marketplace, and there need to essentially be financial incentives if anything's going to change. So one way you get those incentives is penalties if there's violations of existing law. You can think of the Illinois biometrics law being a really effective tool lately for this. And then there's an opportunity to take what we find in terms of security and privacy problems and convince lawmakers to pass new laws that try to foreclose these things from a policy perspective. Not trying to say that you suddenly solve security or privacy problems if there's a law against it, but at least now maybe combined with enforcement, you have a way to push the industry towards making changes.
I think those are awesome, really great points across the board, and that would be the right goal. In the meantime, until we have those things, there's this thing that folks like to say in security, which is that you have to build security into the foundation. It's a day one concern, and it's a lie. I mean, we know it's a lie. We're constantly to assume that you have all of the possible security considerations, that all of the potential threat models, deployment considerations, the potential attacks ahead of time is unreasonable. We're always adding on security after the fact, one way or the other. Firewalls are a great example of that, where it's done completely outside of the system. And so I think it's absolutely important to try to get the security in early, but when the incentives aren't there, I think we also need to have some kind of principled, systematic way of adding security after the fact. I mean, it would be really great if it was the case that people building new features didn't have to have security as a day one concern or an ever concern. Imagine if all they had to do was implement features, because we could systematically apply the security after the fact. And so I think having some kind of stopgap measures along the way for that is, I think, really important until we can start aligning these incentives.
Thank you. A lot of really good insights there. So I think we are pretty much way over time. We started over time, so I'm going to not take full blame for that. But in the interest of kind of respecting everyone's time, I think we'll just close it out with one final question. And I think just to kind of maybe tie a few themes together. So in this last discussion on IoT security and privacy, Stefan was talking about location privacy. And one of the things that he said struck a chord with me, which he said, a lot of people have no idea who's getting this kind of data. I agree. I work on this stuff. And then in talking to social scientists across campus, they're like, hey, look at this cool location data we're using to do contact tracing and track mobility through parks. And I'm like, huh? You have that? But I guess my question is to kind of turn things around a little bit, which is to say that some of the recipients of this data are us in the end. It's the researchers. We typically think of IoT privacy in terms of advertising and surveillance and things like that. But we are also the consumers of this data. So how should we be be thinking about that. I mean, this is not a hypothetical. I think we all in our collaborations have the ability to, walk across the campus or across the hallway and get one of these data sets, or in some cases we gather them ourselves. So as researchers, how do we use these responsibly? Good, I stumped everyone. That's good. All right.
I mean,
I mean,
don't
the
do
first thing that
terrible
popped to mind
things is
is
the traditional answer.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool consequentialist. So from my standpoint, the question is, as a result of your work, did you make things worse for people or better for people?
Yeah.
And I think certainly the mere act of using one of these data sets, we are such a small fraction, like a pimple on a fraction of a % of the use of this data, that I don't think our use or non-use is what is driving the privacy risks that people have. And so then the question is, are there individual harms that you cause? And a lot of that is about, what are you going to look at and what are you going to say about what you learn afterwards? And I think there are reasonable controls that one can put in place in that space. Now, it depends also on how the data was gathered. There are some things that just should be verboten.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah, I think Nick, your question is a really good one, and I think there's also a broader question in there about, there is a big tension here, which is that data is useful for things, and not just for researchers, but for company. There's all sorts of features and things that we want, that we need data to be able to have. And so there's kind of a fundamental tension. Like, I think one of the important things in living in the world and making progress in all sorts of directions, even if your research area is security and privacy, and that's where some of your core values are, is recognizing that it's not going to be effective to say, like, no, we can't do anything. Like, the goal is to try to somehow balance these tensions. And I don't have a silver bullet answer for every situation, but I think that there's some value in at least recognizing that there's a tension there, and that collecting data and use of data are different things that you might need to think about differently. And maybe coming back to Dave's earlier point about the role of policy, like, there's all these, and maybe tying together some of the themes of the panel, there are lots of pieces here. Like, there's the technical part, there's the policy part, there's the human part, like, what do people understand and expect? And kind of, we need to think about at the high level all of those things and how they fit together.
Thanks. Well, I think that ties everything together nicely. It was great to see everyone virtually, and thank you so much for your time. This was a really fun discussion. Thanks for the recommendations on pointers for readings, themes, and this big picture discussion was great too. So we'll let you get back to wherever you may be. I'm in my office today for the first time in like a very long time because our power went out. So I'm socially distanced, but yeah, thanks for joining us today. And I think Dave Levin is the session chair for the next panel. So we just get to, the rest of us are bailing out, but Dave, I think.
All right.
Take it.
You're not done with me yet, folks.